Market standards for your experience level, she said, tapping her pen against the manila folder like it was a judge's gavel. We've benchmarked against industry comparables. That's how HR broke the news to me, adjusting her reading glasses in a conference room thick with the scent of stale coffee and unkept promises. One figure on the compensation sheet said everything. This company didn't value what I truly brought to the table. 14 years as Senior Quality Assurance Director. My adjusted pay package, they claimed, now reflected current market positioning. In reality, that positioning meant I was making 58% less than the newly hired innovation lead, the same guy who'd asked me just days earlier what a regression test even was. We worked in the same department, on the same floor. He'd been on the job for less than 3 months. No product launches, no crisis experience, just a Stanford connection and a father with Fortune 500 board ties. These decisions are final, she added, her tone closing the conversation before it had really begun. Everything's been calculated using approved frameworks. I didn't argue, didn't list the disasters I'd averted or point to the wall of certifications behind my desk. Instead, I calmly pulled a document from my briefcase, one I'd prepared 3 days prior, and slid it across the table. 2 weeks' notice, I said, effective immediately at 2:30 p.m. By 2:33 p.m., my badge was deactivated. By 2:41 p.m., my email was locked. By 2:47 p.m., all my system access was gone. And by 3:15 p.m., the COO was sprinting through the executive parking garage, jacket on, no tie, shouting my name like his bonus was on the line. By 4:30 p.m., 12 senior leaders were in an emergency meeting, staring at a crisis report that opened with the exact time I walked out and ended with complete quality system failure, 89 plant and projected liability, FDA audit in 72 hours. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me step back and explain how a quiet, detail-oriented quality professional became the most damaging resignation in company history, simply by choosing to leave. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. And let me know your thoughts on today's one in the comments. I read every message. My name is Victor Langston. At headquarters, they called me Langston. First names felt too informal in pharma, especially when you're the one keeping the company from triggering a regulatory shutdown. I'm 47. For the past 20 years, I've ensured that every drug leaving our facility met the standards that protect lives and keep executives out of court. I didn't get here through elite networks or Ivy League alumni mixers. My degree came from a small regional college most people couldn't find unless they'd lived nearby. Before that, I spent 6 years as a lab tech in a research hospital, where I learned a hard truth. Precision isn't optional. If your documentation fails, people die. Period. After the hospital, I worked my way through smaller manufacturers before landing at Corvus Pharmaceutical Solutions, a mid-sized firm that liked to say it was advancing patient care through innovative therapeutics. In truth, we made reliable generics and specialty compounds for hospitals that needed a supplier who wouldn't cut corners. Because in our world, corners cut meant patients got ineffective meds. Missed contamination meant real people got sick. Falsified records meant federal agents showed up with subpoenas and criminal charges. I joined Corvus 14 years ago as a quality control supervisor. Back then, the company was leaner and more grounded, run by founders who knew reputation was everything in pharma. Our equipment was old, our software outdated, and our validation protocols barely cleared FDA minimums, so I made myself essential. I took on audit. Prep no one wanted, untangled deviation reports that had sat untouched for months, and memorized every machine, regulation, and validation rule the original team had ever put in place. Soon, people started saying, "Check with Langston first." At first, it was informal. Eventually, it was policy. I still have the email from my first major crisis, a contamination scare that nearly halted our main production line during peak season. We were hours from failing deliveries to hospitals in 4 states. I'd only been there 18 months. I traced it to a microscopic flaw in a gasket seal everyone assumed was fine, and stopped the contamination before it spread beyond one batch. The founder's reply was brief. Excellent work. Customers never knew how close we came. That became my standard. Solve the problem so thoroughly that no one ever sees the chaos behind the compliance. Over time, I moved up, from supervisor to manager to director of quality systems. HR always managed to title. My role's just under the pay grade that would trigger serious compensation reviews. But I didn't care. As long as I controlled the systems that kept our facility compliant and patients safe. I built the audit protocols, designed the tracking databases, and wrote the training guides new hires used to understand why we did things a certain way. My knowledge didn't come from textbooks, it came from real failures. The supplier who switched raw materials without notice, the ops lead who ran equipment outside, validated limits to meet deadlines, and the procurement officer who chose a cheaper vendor selling counterfeit parts. I kept meticulous records, not to build a case, but because that's how quality systems work. Track deviations, investigate causes, implement corrections, prevent recurrence. Over time, you start seeing patterns, what breaks, why it breaks, and which warnings were ignored beforehand. Then, Corvus shifted course. The board brought in a new CEO, Richard Carstairs. Polished, investor-friendly, and fluent in buzzwords like synergy and optimization. He arrived with a private equity CFO, an HR chief known for restructuring, and a new mantra. We need to modernize our talent strategy. In practice, modernize meant two things: hire people with shiny credentials and pay them based on those credentials, not on actual expertise. Quality didn't escape this transformation. We suddenly had quality strategy advisors with MBAs and minimal pharmaceutical experience. They excelled at creating presentations about risk mitigation, but had never investigated an out-of-specification result. They scheduled meetings about optimizing meeting efficiency. They discussed frameworks for optimizing frameworks. Meanwhile, I remained the person operations contacted at 11:47 p.m. when environmental monitoring detected particulates in the clean room and production needed clearance before the morning shift. The first genuine warning sign appeared. When Corvus launched an executive leadership development initiative targeting high-potential early career professionals. Translation: recent graduates from recognized programs. They received rotational assignments, executive mentorship, and starting compensation packages that made veteran employees quietly compare pay stubs during lunch breaks. One of them was a young man named Derek Ashford, 26 years old, Stanford MBA with an undergraduate biology degree completed mostly online while he worked at his family's investment firm. Intelligent in the way people who excel at standardized testing are intelligent. He'd interned at a prestigious consulting firm and had slide decks to demonstrate it. They gave him the title Quality Innovation Associate initially. Within 4 months, they changed it to Quality Innovation Manager. Within 8 months, Associate Director of Strategic Quality Initiatives. He had direct access to the CEO. He also had direct access to quality systems he fundamentally didn't understand, because leadership decided it would be developmental for him to lead cross-functional improvement projects. One afternoon, Derek distributed an internal analysis comparing legacy quality personnel compensation to market competitive ranges for strategic talent. He'd anonymized the data, but anonymization doesn't work when sample sizes make individuals obvious. It was obvious. That's when I saw it documented officially. My total compensation after 14 years was barely exceeding what the leadership development program hired at entry level. Derek specifically, the one I'd been assigned to mentor, was earning 58% more than me. I didn't confront anyone. Not immediately. I did something more calculated. I started documenting systematically. The actual confrontation came 4 months later in that HR conference room. "Victor," said the HR director, a woman named Beverly Thornton, who always seemed one emergency away from burnout, "we've completed our annual compensation review cycle. We're adjusting your package to align with our updated market positioning framework." She slid the analysis across the table toward me. My adjustment was 2.5%. "Market positioning framework," I said, though I already understood. She forced herself to maintain eye contact. "We must maintain internal equity across the organization. The leadership development candidates have specific credentials that command different market valuations. Stanford MBAs, I stated. She hesitated, then confirmed with a slight nod. You understand their market value reflects different dynamics. And mine? You've been here 14 years. You have institutional knowledge, job security, and frankly, your compensation already reflects significant tenure. Significant tenure at 58% of their starting salary, I said quietly. Beverly's professional mask slipped briefly. Victor, I'm being as transparent as regulations allow. If this compensation adjustment isn't acceptable, your options are to accept the offer or pursue other opportunities. My options: accept being categorized as a cost center to minimize or leave. I'd anticipated this exact conversation. I removed a document from my briefcase and placed it where her analysis had been. I choose to pursue other opportunities, I said, signing my name carefully, effective 2:30 p.m. today. Beverly stared at my resignation letter like I'd placed a venomous snake on the conference table. You don't need to decide immediately, she said quickly. Consider it over the weekend. Discuss it with your family. We can schedule a follow-up meeting next week. No, I said, we can't. You've just communicated exactly how Corvus values my contributions. I believe you completely. Her shoulders dropped. HR professionals always get positioned between terrible policies and angry employees, expected to make everyone feel satisfied about outcomes that satisfy nobody. Will you at least stay through the FDA audit? She asked. It's scheduled for next week. We need your expertise for the inspection. I smiled, and for the first time in months, it felt genuine. My expertise is documented in the quality management system. My procedures are current. My resignation is effective today. At 2:30 p.m., my resignation became official. I packed my personal items, a desk lamp, my coffee mug with the "Quality is not an act, it is a habit," quote, my external monitor, and most importantly, my personal compliance notebook. 14 years of deviations, investigations, undocumented system quirks, and if this situation repeats, execute these specific steps first, entries. Patterns that never made it into the official quality system, because official systems documented what we wanted auditors to believe was true, not what the systems had actually taught us through failures. I walked through the quality department, nodded at colleagues who suddenly became intensely focused on their computer screens, and took the elevator down to the main lobby. At 2:33 p.m., my access badge deactivated. At 2:41 p.m., my corporate email account locked. At 2:47 p.m., my system credentials were revoked. At 2:53 p.m., the first system alert triggered. I didn't see it from inside. I saw it the way any concerned professional would, through my personal connections with people still working there who were suddenly very worried. A text message from James, one of the senior technicians I'd trained years ago. VL, something's wrong with the environmental monitoring system. It's showing critical alerts, but nobody knows how to interpret them. Are you still here? I sat in my vehicle in the parking structure, engine off, reading the messages accumulating on my personal phone. Another message from Sarah in documentation. The FDA pre-audit checklist is showing 12 critical gaps. Derek is panicking. He's asking where you keep the historical validation files. What the messages didn't say, but I knew from experience, was what was actually happening behind those alerts. The environmental monitoring system wasn't malfunctioning. It was detecting exactly what it was designed to detect: environmental conditions drifting outside validated parameters. The system I'd calibrated specifically to catch these deviations before they became compliance failures. Normally, this was where I'd intervene. I'd already know which environmental control unit was failing, which validation protocol to reference, and which corrective action to implement immediately to prevent production shutdown. The validation files Derek was desperately searching for? They were exactly where they'd always been, in the quality management system I'd organized, but organized using a logic that required understanding how pharmaceutical validation actually worked, not how an MBA thought it should be organized. But I wasn't on call anymore. The phone in my pocket belonged to a different company now, a company that had responded to my exploratory conversation 6 weeks ago with, "Whenever you're ready to discuss opportunities, we're very interested." I'd already discussed it. They'd already offered. I'd already accepted, contingent only on start date negotiation. So at 3:02 p.m., I forwarded my signed offer letter from Bartlett Industries to my personal email, glanced once more at the increasingly desperate text messages, and started my vehicle. At 3:15 p.m., I was exiting the parking structure when I saw someone in business attire sprinting toward my car, jacket flapping, waving both arms frantically. It was Thomas Brennan, the Chief Operating Officer's executive assistant, normally impeccably composed, currently not composed at all. He was breathless, tie askew, and dress shoes sliding slightly on the concrete as he ran toward me. "Victor Langston, stop! Please stop!" I lowered my window. Thomas reached my vehicle, gripping the doorframe like he needed it for physical support. "Richard needs you immediately. There's a critical situation. Environmental monitoring is showing failures across multiple clean rooms. Production is stopped. The FDA audit is in 72 hours, and Derek can't locate half the documentation they'll request." "I don't work there anymore," I said calmly. "Remember? Accept the offer or pursue other opportunities." His eyes showed something between desperation and anger. "This isn't the time for games, Victor. We have a genuine crisis." "This isn't a game," I said. "This is a boundary. You can't underpay someone for 14 years, tell them to accept it or leave, and then demand they fix your crisis after they choose to leave." "Can you at least come back upstairs?" he pleaded. "Just for 2 hours? Consult? We'll compensate you appropriately." I glanced at my dashboard clock. 3:17 p.m. "Tell Richard he can schedule consulting time through Bartlett Industries. They'll be happy to discuss their standard rates for my expertise." His expression shifted from pleading to something harder. "You're really going to do this? Walk away while we're facing a potential shutdown?" "I'm doing exactly what Beverly told me to do," I finished. "Pursuing other opportunities. You chose not to value my expertise. Now the systems are teaching you what my documentation couldn't." I raised my window and drove away. At 3:24 p.m., my former colleague Margaret sent me a message. "Whatever you just did, I respect it. Richard just screamed, 'How did we let our most critical quality resource leave over a compensation dispute?' in front of the entire leadership team." I didn't respond. By 4:15 p.m., the crisis had escalated beyond environmental monitoring. The production batch that had been running when I left was now quarantined because nobody could verify whether it had been manufactured within validated parameters during the environmental excursion. That batch represented 3.2 million in product that might need to be destroyed. By 4:30 p.m., 12 people were assembled in the executive conference room with the board calling in remotely. The CEO, the CFO, the Chief Human Resources Officer, the VP of Operations, the Quality Assurance Manager who'd been my direct report, Derek Ashford, Beverly from HR, the General Counsel, and someone from Regulatory Affairs who looked like they wished they had retired last month. I know this because Margaret, who'd always been loyal to quality over politics, forwarded me the meeting minutes afterward. They read like a pharmaceutical disaster playbook. 4:32 p.m. Emergency leadership session. Richard Carstairs opened with the kind of measured tone that precedes explosions. "We have a critical quality situation affecting multiple production areas. Estimated financial impact is currently 3.2 million in quarantined product and climbing. The FDA audit is in 72 hours. I need to understand what happened and why we weren't prepared." The Quality Assurance Manager, a decent person named Linda Hu, who'd been promoted into my former role 6 months ago, tried to explain. "We're experiencing environmental monitoring alerts across clean rooms B through F. The system is functioning correctly, but interpreting the data and implementing appropriate corrective actions requires specific expertise." "What specific expertise?" demanded one of the board members calling in remotely, a venture capitalist named Howard Simmons who'd made his fortune in software and thought pharmaceuticals worked the same way. Linda hesitated. The environmental monitoring system was designed and validated by Victor Langston. He built in specific algorithms and alert thresholds that require understanding the underlying validation logic to interpret correctly. "Where is Langston?" another board member asked. I recognized the voice. Patricia Vance, a former FDA inspector who'd joined the board specifically because of her regulatory expertise. The room went silent. "He resigned this afternoon," Beverly said quietly. "Effective immediately." "Resigned or was forced out?" Patricia's voice was sharp. "He resigned," Beverly repeated. "His compensation adjustment didn't meet his expectations." "What adjustment?" 2.5%. Patricia's voice sliced through the room like a scalpel. "You gave a 2.5% increase to your only quality professional who actually understands your environmental monitoring system during the same compensation cycle in which you hired how many MBA graduates and at what starting salary range?" The silence that followed was thick with implication. Everyone in that room, executives who'd championed modernization, board members who'd signed off on restructuring bonuses, and the HR director who'd delivered the insult with rehearsed neutrality, now faced the grotesque arithmetic of their own decisions. Richard Carstairs, ever the polished performer, tried to pivot. "Let's focus on crisis management first. We can address personnel decisions in retrospect." He turned to Linda who, his tone urgent but strained. "Linda, what's the current status?" Linda, who had inherited Langston's title but not his authority, opened her laptop with the quiet reluctance of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "We've confirmed the Environmental Control Unit in Clean Room D is operating outside validated parameters. We're attempting corrective actions, but we keep hitting validation questions we can't answer because they require reference to historical validation files." "Where are the validation files?" Richard demanded. "In the quality management system," Linda replied carefully. "But they're organized using a structure Langston developed over more than a decade. It's not alphabetical or department-based. It's built around failure modes, risk pathways, and process interdependencies. Derek's been searching, but the logic isn't immediately apparent to someone unfamiliar with pharmaceutical validation." "The files are missing?" Patricia asked, disbelief sharpening her voice. "No," Linda clarified, choosing her words like a technician handling live wires. "They're not missing. They're just inaccessible without the right context. It's like having a library where every book is labeled in a language only the librarian speaks." Howard Simmons, the venture capitalist who'd made his fortune in SaaS and assumed all data was just searchable, leaned forward. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly. We have critical FDA-mandated validation documentation that only one person in this entire company knew how to navigate efficiently. That person resigned today, and we have a federal audit in 72 hours. "We have the documentation," Derek interjected, voice rising with defensive urgency. "It's just taking time to locate all the specific files the auditors will request." "How much time?" Nathan Russo, the CFO, asked without looking up from his laptop, where he was already modeling financial collapse scenarios. "We're working on it," Derek said weakly. Nathan finally raised his eyes. "The current estimated impact is $3.2 million in quarantined product. And that's just today. If we can't resolve this before the FDA audit, we're looking at warning letters, consent decrees, and a probable production shutdown. That's not millions, that's tens of millions. Potentially complete facility closure." The room seemed to shrink. "Can we bring Langston back?" Richard asked, turning to Beverly. "Thomas tried," Beverly said, her voice small. "Langston said we could schedule consulting through his new employer." "His new employer?" Richard's voice climbed an octave. "When did he secure new employment?" "Apparently today," Beverly admitted. "He mentioned they'd be happy to discuss their consulting rates." Howard let out a dry, humorless laugh. "So let me get this straight. We systematically underpaid the one person who designed and maintained our most critical compliance infrastructure. He walks out the door. Within an hour, our systems begin failing. And now we're expected to pay him as an external consultant at rates that will likely be 3 or 4 times his former salary, if he even agrees to help." Patricia didn't look up. "If I were him, I wouldn't," she said coldly. "Not after being told to accept a 2.5% raise while watching fresh MBA hires earn nearly double his total compensation." Richard, desperate now, turned to Robert Flynn, the general counsel. "Can we compel him? Contract obligations, intellectual property claims? Robert shook his head slowly. His resignation was clean. All documentation belongs to the company. That's undisputed. But knowledge, judgment, institutional memory? Those aren't intellectual property, they're human capital. We can't force him to consult. And if we try, say, by threatening litigation or invoking non-competes, we'd not only lose in court, but we'd trigger immediate FDA scrutiny. That's a guaranteed public relations and regulatory nightmare. What about the people he trained? Richard pressed, grasping at straws. Derek, you've been working directly with Langston for 8 months. Can you navigate the system? Derek, who had spent his tenure crafting strategic roadmaps and innovation frameworks, now looked like he wished the conference table would swallow him whole. I've mostly been focused on strategic quality initiatives, he stammered. The technical implementation, the actual system architecture, the validation logic, that was Langston's domain. You're the Associate Director of Strategic Quality Initiatives, Richard snapped, his voice now edged with fury. You've been presenting to the board about optimizing quality throughput. Are you telling me you can't execute on the very systems you've been directing? The validation architecture is more complex than, Derek began. Then what? Patricia cut in, her tone glacial. Then the glossy slides you've been circulating? Richard, blaming Derek won't bring Langston back or prepare us for the FDA. We need a solution, now. Linda spoke up again, her voice calm but heavy with realism. We could try to reverse engineer Langston's systems, reconstruct his mental model from the documentation, system logs, and historical deviations. How long would that take? Nathan asked. Weeks, Linda said. Possibly months to fully understand the interdependencies. This isn't just about finding files. It's about interpreting why decisions were made, how alerts were calibrated, and when thresholds were adjusted based on real-world failures. We have 72 hours, Nathan said flatly. Every hour we're down, we lose $420,000 in revenue. Our top 3 competitors are already calling our customers, offering guaranteed supply. If we miss this audit, we don't just lose contracts, we lose credibility. Permanently, Robert added, his voice grim. And if the FDA finds that our quality systems collapsed immediately after the departure of our lead quality architect, especially when that departure followed a documented compensation dispute, they'll assume systemic negligence. That's not just a warning letter, that's a multi-year investigation. Possible criminal referrals for data falsification or patient risk. The meeting dissolved into finger-pointing. Who approved the talent modernization budget? Why did no one flag Langston as a single point of failure? How could HR justify paying strategic hires 58% more than the person who'd kept the FDA off their backs for 14 years? By 5:45 p.m., the environmental alerts had spread to clean rooms G and H production across the entire sterile manufacturing wing was halted. Technicians stood idle, watching. Dashboards flash red with warnings they couldn't interpret. By 6:30 p.m., Richard turned to Nathan with a defeated nod. Contact him, use whatever resources are required. The call came at 6:47 p.m. I was in the sleek, quiet onboarding suite at Bartlett Industries, signing my final paperwork when my personal phone rang. Victor, this is Nathan Russo, CFO at Corvus. I know today didn't conclude ideally. I'm calling to explore whether there's any possibility of bringing you back to assist with this situation. As an employee, I asked, we're flexible. Emergency consulting, contract work, name your terms. I have a new position, I said evenly. I start officially Monday morning. We're prepared to offer substantial compensation, Nathan pressed. Name your rate. I had imagined this moment during my drive across town, the fantasy of quoting $10,000 an hour, of making them bleed for their arrogance. But the truth was quieter, sharper. Nathan, I said, I don't want your money. I wanted respect. I wanted fair pay for 14 years of keeping your company out of federal court. I wanted not to be told I should understand why someone who didn't know what a regression test was earned more than me. You had 14 years to fix that. You chose not to. There was a long pause on the other end, long enough for the reality to sink in. I'm not frustrated, I added. I'm done. Your systems are failing because you treated the person maintaining them as overhead. That's not my problem anymore. That's the lesson. And with that, I ended the call, not with drama, but with finality. Because some truths don't need shouting. They just need silence to echo. Nathan, I don't want your money, I said, voice steady, almost quiet. I wanted respect. I wanted to be compensated fairly for the expertise I was providing every single day. I wanted to not be told, with a straight face, that I should understand why someone fresh out of business school who didn't know the difference between a validation protocol and a PowerPoint slide was earning 58% more than me. You had 14 years to fix that imbalance, 14 years of flawless audits, 0 regulatory shutdowns, and crisis after crisis averted in silence. And you chose not to. Victor, I understand you're frustrated, Nathan began, his tone laced with the well-practiced empathy of a CFO who'd never once had to clean up a sterile room at 2 a.m. I'm not frustrated, I cut in. I'm done. Your systems are failing, not because they're broken, but because you treated the person maintaining them as disposable overhead. That's not my problem anymore. That's the lesson you needed to learn. We're facing potential FDA enforcement action, he pressed, voice tightening. This could shut down the entire facility. You were facing that risk for years, I replied. You just didn't notice, because I kept fixing it quietly, without fanfare, without demanding credit. Now the mask is off, the scaffolding's gone, and suddenly you see the rot. But that's not on me. That's on a leadership team that confused credentials with competence and cost savings with strategy. I ended the call. By 9:30 p.m., Corvus's quality team had patched together a partial recovery. They'd stabilized the environmental control units in clean rooms B through F, but the validation status remained technically non-compliant, marked pending verification in a system that didn't allow pending states during active production. The dashboards I'd designed weren't malfunctioning. They were doing exactly what I'd built them to do: flag unverified conditions, undocumented interventions, and deviations from validated states. They'd treated the symptoms, the alarms, but ignored the disease, a culture that elevated titles over technical mastery. By 11:45 p.m., another alert blared. This time in Clean Room A, the flagship suite used for high-potency oncology compounds. The environmental excursion cascaded into the manufacturing execution system, triggering a data integrity failure that corrupted batch records across 3 production lines. Now, they couldn't prove, legally or scientifically, that any of the week's output had been manufactured within validated parameters. Legally, that meant everything was suspect. Financially, it meant millions in unreleasable inventory. Regulatorily, it was a death spiral. Richard, increasingly desperate, authorized Nathan to try again. This time, the offer wasn't veiled in corporate euphemisms. It was raw and urgent. $75,000 for 3 days of emergency consulting, just enough to shepherd them through the FDA audit. I declined, not out of spite, but clarity. Money couldn't buy back 14 years of eroded trust or undo the message they'd sent when they handed me a 2.5% raise while paying a novice almost. Double my salary. Some wounds aren't healed with cash. They're healed with institutional change. And that only comes after consequence. That evening, my phone buzzed. It was Dr. Helena Vasquez, CEO of Bartlett Industries, the woman who'd offered me a role based not on my resume, but on a 2-hour conversation about data integrity and aseptic processing. Saw the industry reports about Corvus, she wrote. Is that your former employer? Want to discuss it? I gave her the short version: the HR meeting, the resignation, and the cascading system failures. Her reply came instantly. Good for you for walking away. Want my advice? Don't go back, not even for consulting money. Some lessons are only learned through consequences, and they need to learn this one fully. She was right. Reinserting myself would have let them off the hook. It would have turned a systemic failure into a personnel problem they could solve with a short-term fix. But real change requires pain, and Corvus hadn't felt enough of it yet. By week's end, the bill had mounted. $47 million in destroyed product, halted production, emergency contractor fees, and frantic attempts to reassure panicked clients. They hired 4 elite consulting firms, global names with glossy brochures and 6-figure daily rates. But none could reconstruct the logic behind the quality systems because none bothered to ask the one person who'd built them. They treated documentation as a static artifact, not a living map of institutional memory. The FDA audit was, as predicted, a catastrophe. Inspectors found critical deficiencies across the board, validation protocols that existed only in fragmented folders, environmental controls operated without real-time verification, batch records with unverified electronic signatures, and, most damning, no evidence of effective quality oversight. The result? A formal warning letter with language so severe it hinted at a consent decree, court-enforced, supervision, third-party audits, and potential criminal liability. Within 3 weeks, their largest customer, a national hospital chain, publicly terminated its contract, citing concerns about quality system reliability and regulatory compliance. 5 more followed within 6 weeks. Investors fled. By quarter's end, Corvus stock had plummeted 41%. The board ousted Richard Carstairs. Nathan Russo was transitioned to an advisory role, corporate speak for exile. The HR chief was restructured out. Derek Ashford vanished into a consulting firm in a sector with no FDA oversight. Even Beverly reached out on LinkedIn. "You were right about everything. I apologize for not advocating harder. I'm leaving too. This culture is broken." 8 months later, I got a call from Patricia Vance, the former FDA inspector turned board member who'd asked the hard questions during that emergency meeting. She was now interim CEO, tasked with salvaging what remained. "Victor," she said, voice uncharacteristically humble, "I want to apologize, not just on behalf of the company, but personally. I've spent weeks reviewing your old submissions, your risk alerts, and your compensation appeals. You tried to warn us about single points of failure. You tried to explain that quality isn't a function of titles, it's a function of knowledge, experience, and relentless attention to detail. We didn't listen because we wanted to believe there was a shortcut, a way to optimize quality without investing in the people who actually deliver it. There isn't." I listened, silent. "I also want to make you an offer," she continued, "not to return as an employee, but as a technical advisor to the board. Help us rebuild the quality culture properly. We're implementing compensation transparency, creating technical career ladders that don't force experts into management, and launching something we're calling critical expertise. Retention planning. We never want to lose institutional knowledge this catastrophically again." The offer was generous. The scope was meaningful. Most importantly, it was rooted in respect, not desperation. "I'll consider it," I said. I accepted, not for the money, but because I believed in the possibility of redemption. Under Patricia's leadership, Corvus changed. They hired a new chief quality officer, a woman with 25 years in sterile manufacturing, not a single MBA. They documented every system with traceability back to real-world failure modes. They promoted Linda to VP of Quality Operations, and they enshrined technical expertise as a path to influence and compensation equal to executive roles. 18 months later, over lunch, Linda told me Derek had reached out. "He wants back in," she said. "Says he's learned that strategy without substance is just expensive theater." "What did you tell him?" I asked. "That we have a spot for a quality specialist. He'd need to start at the bottom, pass competency assessments, and earn his way up. No shortcuts." "He's starting next month," she said. "Took a 45% pay cut, but he seems serious this time." I smiled. Some people do learn, usually not until the system teaches them the expensive way. That night, I opened my old compliance notebook, the one filled with 14 years of near misses, ignored warnings, and quiet interventions. On the final page, written the day I resigned, were these words: "Systems fail in predictable patterns. Organizations fail when they stop listening to the people who understand the systems. The only question is whether you learn before the failure or after." Corvus learned after. It cost them $47 million, 3 executives, 8 major customers, and a shattered reputation. All because they believed a market positioning framework mattered more than the human architecture holding their compliance together. The real vindication wasn't watching them scramble. It was seeing them finally build technical career paths. It was knowing that when a new hire now asks, "Where are the validation files?" the answer isn't "Check with Langston." It's a documented, searchable, logically structured system designed by people who finally understand that expertise is the foundation of quality. They wanted me to understand why I was paid less. By 4:30 p.m. that day, when their world began to unravel, they understood perfectly. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply walk away and let the silence teach the lesson you've been shouting for years.